All right, good afternoon. I guess it's actually still morning. Good morning, class. I'm just picking up right where we left off. Spent uh, most of our class time together today after just discussing briefly or having a class discussion on the East Asian values and how different students felt about whether the notion of a universal declaration of human rights was appropriate, that are human rights, essentially are human rights universal, or are they subject to cultural values and cultural uh, differences. So anyway, today we are concerning ourselves primarily with the Washington Consensus and the Beijing Consensus. These are two really different approaches that in one case, the West, particularly under the leadership of the United States, an approach that the West has taken to its relationship, particularly its economic relationship with developing countries. And what we'll see toward the end of my comments is that China, under the Beijing Consensus, has taken a fairly different approach. And I'm going to try to characterize that. Your reading for tomorrow, which is also the reading for today, will also take you further in exploration of the Beijing Consensus. I'm going to make pretty brief comments. I'm going to try to keep my comments economic so that I'll be putting these obviously these bullets up on the screen, and I'll discuss them a little bit, but for the most part I'll leave them to speak for themselves, especially these first ones since I've already spoken about them in class. So I'll click through here, kind of starting with the opening sense that the Washington Consensus has not been effective in terms of how it's left the relationship between the United States and the West with the developing world. This is an effort to explain sort of the global economic challenges that brought about the Washington Consensus. I spoke in class talking about how fiscal policy had been, for a few decades, at least since World War II, sort of the understood approach that governments should intervene in economies when economic recession or economic downturns strike. The problem became in the 1970s, it was sort of a perfect storm, or an imperfect storm, if you will, of inflation and recession hitting the global economy at the same time, and that rarely happens. There was very little economic precedent for that, but nonetheless, the unique circumstances of the global economy brought that situation about, and it asked new questions that demanded new approaches. And one of the new approaches was this monetary policy, which was really interesting. It brought with it, it was a conservative economic policy, conservative in the sense that it did not feature much of a role for government, and that has largely been a the liberal tradition of allowing individuals as opposed to governments to be the primary actors within society and within economies. Conservatives have, by and large, been strong supporters of individual action. And monetary policy became not just an economic policy, but in some ways a political conservatism that once again sought to reinstate the importance of individuals and a reduced role for government. So this new solution was to create a market society, one where markets, not government laws or government regulation, determined the proper relationship of supply and demand and individual action within the economy at large. Supporters of monetary policy, who are also sort of, in many respects, the neoliberals, the supporters of the Washington Consensus, had a view that government is ultimately the problem when it comes to, well, most things, actually, not just the economy, but also society. So the smaller the government, the better, and definitely keep the government out of the economy. replaced the helping hand of government, which was, the fiscal policy advocates would have said that the government offers a helping hand, but the monetary policy proponents or advocates would have not agreed with that assessment. They would have instead preferred the invisible hand, let individuals follow their self-interest, and that will serve as an invisible hand that guides the economy as a whole. Specifically, and this isn't new to you, you might recall this from Unit 1, what the neoliberals and also proponents of monetary policy, again, the spigot is to remind you of the role of interest rates, right? Low interest rates effectively push more money out into individuals acting within the economy because the costs of borrowing money are cheaper when there are low interest rates. Similarly, if the economy becomes too hot, if it's moving too fast and it's growing too fast, that can produce a fear of inflation. So monetary policy then increases interest rates, which has the consequence of taking money out of the economy. So think of the spigot as being shut off or slowed to a trickle so that the amount of money being borrowed is less and thereby decreases inflation. The way that this plays out on the ground for the neoliberals, the hopes that they had is that when money is lent to developing countries, it will be done in a way that requires certain conditions to be met, and that will mean deregulation, meaning the government will have less of a role in regulating the economy, the idea being that markets can regulate themselves. If someone makes bad peanut butter that hurts people, people will just naturally no longer buy that peanut butter. If clothing is made cheaply, that's not something the government needs to worry about. People will, through their own decisions, not buy cheap clothes or poorly made clothes. They will gravitate toward the better clothes. Okay? Liberalization refers to freeing markets. It would mean that trade barriers like tariffs and quotas would be eliminated so that the trade of raw materials, the trade of finished goods, the trade of labor becomes more accessible. One of the ways that liberalization has happened in recent decades is it's become much easier for American manufacturers to move their production facilities to China, where there is by and large cheaper labor. That would be an example of the liberal trade or the open trade of labor between different countries. That's something that neoliberals would champion. And then finally, privatization. Incidentally, it's something that President-elect Donald Trump campaigned against, right? This notion of bringing factories back to the United States or not losing factories to overseas. In some ways, that could be thought of as an illiberal or unliberal trade policy. Finally, privatization. According to neoliberals and proponents of monetary policy, there is no benefit to allowing the government to handle a certain sector of the economy. All sectors of the economy, in as much as it's possible, should be handled by the private sector. So for a fierce neoliberal, they would even argue that public education is a bad thing, that education would be better if it were handled by private companies who ran and operated our schools. They would be more efficient, they would be of higher quality, so on and so forth. So privatization means shrinking the footprint of government and putting as much of the economy in the hands of the private sector. Okay? And again, this is economic liberalism. True liberalism, true classic liberalism is both economic and political, but neoliberalism really focuses on the economic liberalism side, the free decisions of in the economy. So for neoliberals, again, here we have a quote by Ayn Rand, who is combining the political freedom with the economic freedom. She's far from alone in this. Milton Friedman has many quotes, but it is worth noting that sometimes political freedom, as in the photo shown below, is people criticizing the economic system as it is. You'll see here a desire for higher minimum wages. That's not something that a neoliberal would be a strong proponent of, but sometimes political freedom gives way to claims for greater economic assurances. I just wanted to capture that a little bit. So in some ways, these two photos are in conflict with one another. Not so sure Ayn Rand would agree with the use of the political freedom below, or at least they just have a difference of political opinion there. So economic market society isn't just an economic theory. According to the neoliberals, it's also it goes hand in hand with political freedom. People need to have political freedom so that they can operate and make independent economic decisions, and that much of market behavior is also tied to political freedom. So the Washington Consensus becomes, I'm going to call it a renaissance for conservatism in the 1970s. This is a time when the Republican Party is growing in its influence, a time where Ronald Reagan emerges, former governor of California, who will run for presidency of the United States in starting in 1979. He'll win in 80 and will be inaugurated in 81. Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, the moral majority, which combines Christian evangelicalism with social conservatives and economic conservatives. It brings back quite a bit of power to the American right. And all of this is happening at a time when important international institutions like the IMF and World Bank are growing in their influence. And these will, of course, be the institutions that lend money to the developing world. Okay, so the IMF and World Bank using carrots of money, but requiring also using sticks, meaning conditions placed upon their loans. And I'm going to click through these a little bit more quickly. The global recession, as we already talked about in the 1970s, created circumstances where developing countries needed to borrow money from the developed world so that their governments and societies could continue to function. They could develop themselves economically to try to escape the economic recession that was gripping not just them, but many corners of the world. Structural adjustment programs became the way in which developing world institutions like IMF and World Bank required changes in the way in which developing countries operated. So think liberalization, privatization, deregulation. These were the reforms that the developing world insisted upon from, that the developed world insisted upon from the developing world. So the Washington Consensus was tied to really 10 specific conditions, all at which were aimed at liberalizing the economies of these developing world. And it's also worth noting that it really served many of the interests of not just conservatives in the United States, but conservatives in the world as a whole. This was a time when organized labor, collective labor, started to lose its hold, and for much of the last several decades, union labor has lost hold, largely because neoliberals and proponents of the Washington Consensus would argue that collective labor or unions are a violation of liberal trade. People are not freely trading labor when it's organized and collected in unions, which have this, they would think of it as artificial power and influence over the trade of labor. Okay, so mixed success for borrowing countries. So what happened? I'll just click through these rather quickly. About 80% of the world's population was subject to structural adjustment programs. And you'll see that the response to that was not so great. What generally happened was neoliberalism served the interests of developed countries, but not so much developing. And here I'll close with my final statement.